So really do appreciate everybody's time today. We're going to jump right in. We're going to be talking a little bit about kind of planning for things that really will occur. So I'm going to just get this going because I know everybody is busy. Just a very quick overview of MHA. We've been around for over 20 years. We really do end-to-end disaster recovery, business continuity, planning, resiliency, all of those things. So you can kind of see we've got some SaaS tools that help with the continuity planning, and we really do like to work with organizations either in the short term or the long term. A lot of our companies, our clients that we work with are here in the long term. Just a quick overview. We've got a lot of different clients that we've worked with over the last several years across all of the different verticals. So I think it brings a lot of experience, but it also has a lot of perspective. So we can leverage what we've done across different industries and apply them either from an industry perspective or from a size, culture, and skill set perspective. So that really helps as opposed to just looking at things from a pure vertical or industry perspective. As mentioned, we do have a full suite from assessing an environment all the way up through helping run and continuous improvement. We also will do spot engagements where we'll come in with an exercise or a tabletop or help with certain documentation or whatever it may be. So we can kind of jump in and help, parachute in, or we can start at the very beginning or jump in at the end and help manage program. Any and all as it relates to the continuity and resiliency space. And as mentioned, we do have an online SaaS tool that helps with the overall management of your program, from understanding and assessing your state of the maturity of your program that would then come up with recommendations and a roadmap, from a business impact analysis tool to help you track, interview, and report on the data, helping maintain, build, and develop plans that you can then use, will integrate in with the BIA tool so that you can pull that data in. Obviously, we have a data repository so that if you do have an event that you need your plans, you can pull them out. It's set up using kind of Google Maps, so you can do it by location, pull it up. There's all your documents, you can reference them. It also includes issue tracking and that type of thing. And then lastly, a residual risk, which is really for those organizations who have very much implemented their program and are in a much more mature state, to look at, now that we've implemented everything, what is the extra risks that might exist that we may want to consider dealing with. All right, so what we want to really do today is really look at the issues that have occurred, what's likely to occur, and really, kind of leveraging exercises and how can we communicate with the organization so that people understand not just what's happened in the past or what they think they should plan for, but what is practically most beneficial to make plans for from an event and a situation perspective. A couple of things that I really like is, truth doesn't change according to our ability to stomach it, and facts do not cease to exist just because they're ignored. I think sometimes when we think about potential issues, potential events that we need to consider, this is very pertinent. I hear we'll talk a little bit about that. The organizations sometimes don't want to hear it, or they're very much historic based. And there's reasons to look at history, but there's also reasons to look at what could happen, even if it hasn't happened, right? That whole idea of lack of planning is actually planning to fail, right? Because just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't, and just because it happened before doesn't mean that's the next likely thing to occur, with one exception that we will talk about. So just some concepts to make sure we're all thinking kind of the same concept, right? We focus on resiliency, and resiliency has a couple of pieces to that. In the old world, we talked recovery, right? Years ago when I started doing this, early in my career, right? Which was failure brings something up, right? So it's really making sure that there is some level of availability, but in most cases, it might be a degraded service. It might be either a technology solution. It may just be a people solution. And it's very much based on RTOs and RPOs. If I'm down, when do I need to be up again? Resiliency really encompasses all of that, which is really then prevention of service outages, including day-to-day needs, people, technology. It's really functionality focused, planned versus unplanned. And then you'll put in the right solution, whether it's ensuring that functionality never goes down, or it is appropriate. It can be down for a few minutes, a few hours, a few days. But really looking at things from a resiliency perspective, as opposed to wait for something to go down, then bring it up. When we think about the various components as it relates to the concepts that we're going to talk about today as the type of events that need to be addressed, these are all the areas that you want to make sure you're addressing within those events, right? What is the technology DR perspective? How are we going to recover the technology that IT is responsible for? What about end user technology, laptops, phones, tablets, or other types of devices? It could be equipment that is tied to some of the IT things, especially in the manufacturing world. Then we got the business continuity and crisis management piece. How are the actual workarounds in place for that event? Will they still work? And then managing the crisis from an organizational perspective. Then make sure you're thinking about single points of failure related to that. On top, that could be technology, it could be equipment, it could be people. What about people issues? And then supply chain and your vendors. How are your vendors impacted? Are they going to be able to support you? Very, very important. Between supply chain and third parties. And then lastly, exercising and training is really allowing people to be prepared. Something that we've been emphasizing a lot lately is just because you have a document doesn't mean you're prepared and functionally can recover. All that means is you put together strategies and ideas, but it's the exercises and training. I've been using the analogy lately of a musical or an art event. People don't walk out on stage with their script reading their lines, right? They do all of that preparation and planning and everything about it. They might step back in the middle of the play. They might step back after and review and look at it, but you can't necessarily pull out your script in the middle of a play. And it's similar for an event. While you'll have it there to reference, it isn't necessarily most beneficial to say step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. You need to know what you need to do and use it as a reference. So when we think about these events that we're going to be talking about, always consider everything we do in business continuity is about risk mitigation, whether that's accepting it, preventing it, limiting it, or moving it to someone else. But an important note on the risk transference, where we move that involvement from someone else, is the risk still exists. It's just you're not responsible for dealing with it. But you want to make sure that whoever you've transferred that to is dealing with it appropriately. And then the difference between risk acceptance, risk avoidance and limitation, is acceptance is not ignoring it. Acceptance is consciously looking at it, saying, I know what this is. We're consciously not going to do anything. Our business continuity plans will address it. And then we've got risk avoidance, which is preventing it, and limitation, which is putting certain remediation in place, but not getting rid of it altogether. But every time I speak with folks, I really like to emphasize that risk acceptance. A lot of times we ignore, and that is not risk acceptance. That's just hoping it will go away or hoping it will never happen. And that's definitely not what we want to do from a continuity perspective. Excuse me. So one of the things I'd like to start with as we get into events to consider, and that is, we're already ready. We've already dealt with these events. This is what we've done in the history, or this is what it's here. I can't tell you how many times I hear this. Just about every organization I work with we already have BC solved because of COVID, that recency bias. We've learned to work from home. We've already dealt with this. Everything has been addressed with COVID. We know that's false, right? There's a bunch of other things, and we'll talk about those, right? Or related to that, work from home. We no longer have continuity issues because we can work from home. That's just not true, right? People issues, vendor issues, technology issues, right? That has nothing to do with work from home. That's just now multiple things. And on top of, from a work from home perspective, what if people's location is unavailable? Have you considered now that people's work from home location or remote work location is now a primary location? And what's the backup for that? Are they going to come back into the office? Are you expecting them to have a solution? What might it be? Something that is not a lot of organizations have thought about. They're just like, oh, it's now the employee's responsibility. Might be, but if they're not prepared, you're not prepared. And then when we think about vendor hosted or cloud solutions, even when I talk about our SaaS solution, I hear a lot, oh, well, they have plans to have the systems available. We don't need to do anything. They're responsible to get them up. True statement. But they're not going to give you your business continuity plans. I've heard several clients lately say, well, we're just going to go to the vendor and they're going to tell us what to do. No, they're not, because they don't know your function. They don't know how you're using their tools. They know what their tools do, but you're going to be using it differently. Every organization has slightly different processes. How are they going to give you a business continuity plan, workarounds, et cetera, because they don't know your business? So it's a really flawed argument. Yes, they're responsible for getting the system up, just like your IT team is responsible for getting the locally managed technology and everything up. But you still need to have a continuity plan in place. So again, we're losing sight of what we're responsible for versus what somebody else is responsible for. That whole risk transference doesn't mean you don't have any risk or responsibility. And then lastly, when we think about technology, we often think of it's only going to be a couple days. And so when we do business impact assessments or we are doing plans, they're like, we're just going to plan for a couple of days of outage. And we're like, well, what happens if it's a week? Well, it'll never happen. Or what happens if it's 3 weeks? And we can give multiple examples of organizations who have had a cyber attack where their systems have been down for weeks, literally 3, 4, 5 weeks, and in some cases more than a month, where some of their systems have not come up because of the length of the outage. If it's a massive breach and they have to take everything down and bring it up, it can be a significant time frame. So this idea of we only have to plan for a couple days, that might be most day-to-day type of issues. But when we start getting into that cyber specific, which is the most relevant, we all know that happens, and not being prepared for how you're going to run your organization manually without systems for a week or more is really being short-sighted in our opinion. So what types of things that have happened that maybe people hope will never occur, right? And people will assume, well, we've got prevention in place, or this will never happen, right? An easy one are natural events, floods, damage to buildings, depending on where you're at, right? Especially when, a lot of organizations, if they're in hurricane regions on the coast or in the Gulf, or Tornado Alley, things like that. Yeah, they know those things are going to happen, but either they're not doing enough preparation, or it's such a low probability that maybe they don't worry about it. But we know of organizations who have had their offices flooded. There could be other reasons floods could happen. I have one client where there's a major water storage system right above where their data center is, and where some of their redundant power is in a basement. If that tower and that water storage goes, it will flood a several block area of a downtown location. Well, are they planning for that? Somewhat, but not really, because they're like, oh, we're not in a floodplain, but you could have a flood. So you need to think about that. Another big thing, especially work from home, what happens if your staff is flooded, right? I actually have worked with an organization multiple years ago, actually, early on when I worked with MHA. And it was a hurricane situation, but everybody lived inland. So they weren't necessarily directly impacted by the hurricane itself, but we're on the call making all the preparations, doing the hurricane prep that they had, was working well. But all of a sudden, a majority of the people lived along the same watershed area, streams, a little bit of a river, and it was overflowing because of the hurricane storm coming through. And the next thing you know, people are saying, my sump pump isn't working, I got to go. Click, 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 click. So 10 people went down to 3 very, very quickly. So thinking about those type of risks, and those things have actually happened where people are like, I can't help anymore, I got to take care of my house. Family, personal property, all those things will take priority over your organization. And don't think that people will sacrifice that to stay on. They will not, and nor should we expect that. And then lastly, I will tell you that this is one I have personally experienced when I was responsible for a data center at one point in my career. We had a sewer backup and had sewage flowing under our raised floor in our data center, starting to risk to get to where it might hit the power. And literally, me and some of my other folks are in there with wetbacks, sucking up as much sewage as we can to keep it going until we could get it stopped, taken care of. Fortunately, in that case, we didn't have to shut off power. But I do know one where they did have to shut off power because it was getting too close. Also know of a situation where there was a vendor issue when they were doing maintenance on some of their UPS power, that controls the power and cleans the power. It took it down, and because that's where all the power goes through, it shut it down. Generator wouldn't help because the UPS was down. Actually happened with the maintenance and with the fix of the solution. Went down twice within a week. So understanding those things can happen just because of errors. You need to understand. Loss of staff. This is one again that hit very close to home. And I have heard other organizations where people were on a personal trip. They were friends outside of work. They went on a major accident on the way home, and multiple people were killed, injured. That included staff, and it also included family members. So we had multiple people in departments that were unavailable for multiple weeks because of this accident. Partly either they were injured, either they were killed, or they were still just dealing with the trauma, or they're dealing with their family. It was an incredibly sad situation. So things like that happen. We don't like to think about it, and we don't want to be negative, but we know we have to plan. How are we either going to help those folks? How are we going to keep the business running, especially if they're critical folks? Looking at things like your travel policy. How many people do you allow to travel on business? Most times executives can't necessarily, more than one or two can't travel in the same vehicle or plane or whatever it may be. You need to look at those things as well. And then think about reputational damage, right? If all you have to do is read the news for these, right? But I'm aware of a couple where literally criminal activity by team or staff actually impacted the reputation of the organization. Got out on the local news that either somebody was stealing from the organization, involved in some other criminal activity, whether it be human trafficking, whatever it may be. And then one where it wasn't so much illegal, but it was reputational, where there were staff members that were that had a side business within the adult industry. And that got out. Now all of a sudden, this organization that built itself on kind of family and values and things like that now had this staff, that was out there. No judgment in how they're living their separate life, but it does impact the organization potentially. Personal issues. I know of one organization where the owners of the company, had the majority share of the ownership, went through a divorce, and within a month or two, that company was out of business. So have we looked at that? How are those relationships, right? Goods and services produced by, socially unacceptable or at least perceived socially unacceptable means. Child labor. There was, in the recent past, some of the coconut water and things like that was potentially sourced from unacceptable vendors. So consider that, because your organization, because you're doing business with them, can have that reputational damage. And then social issues as they change over time. You may not believe it. Your organization's culture may be such that that's not what you believe is right. But as an organization, we're dealing with the greater population as a whole. And so understanding as those things change, what's the risk to you? Not saying you have to change, but you need to understand what that risk might be. How are you going to address it if it does occur, especially around demonstrations and preventing people from, accessing your locations or boycotting you. I mean, look at the most recent Miller Lite issue, right? On both sides, trying to be supportive of maybe one aspect of society, and then another area that was not tied to that. And there was this big pull, made a major issue with Budweiser. So those things, need to be addressed, and they have occurred. So now the question is, how do we help people understand? Excuse me. So additional things, really, this is really more around the events. I've already talked about cyber. I'm not going to go into that. But again, you need to consider cyber events more than just a single app or for a few days. Consider what would happen in multiple weeks. That you need to do. Also, technology outages. I've caused both of those, UPS failures and your own technology and what could happen, especially if it happens frequently. And then lastly, unfortunately, we hear this a lot now, but it is just a necessary part of our planning is active shooter or violent events among team members. Right? We've heard of those as well. Are you addressing that? Do you have plans? And are they effective and fully implemented, right? From the standpoint of communication to how people behave, and are they being trained? So when we think about exercises, this again for us is the most useful way to have people be prepared. Documentation is great, but if you're not practicing, you're not prepared. So what will help in people understanding and maybe helping in their planning and their identification of actions is use scenarios that have not occurred but are possible. Don't use the same ones over and over and over and over and over. Now, cyber may be one you do, but change up how that cyber occurs. Change what happens, change what systems, change what people have to do, right? But also, it can be a violent event. It could be a reputational issue. It could be a building issue. But work through that so people actually have to think through these different events. It's amazing when you do that how people have not thought about it. We did one with an organization where there was criminal activity going on within their organization, and they were using organizational resources for that criminal activity. It really brought up to light, one of the questions came up was, what is our vetting process? Do we need to review that? Is that right? How are we going to handle this? Are we prepared if law enforcement comes and shuts our operation down because it's that? So it was very much enlightening, and they hadn't really thought about it. Frequent tests with individual or several departments. We really like the idea of multiple tests, short things throughout the year, not just one annual 4-hour test where everybody gets together and it's this whole event and we have fun and it's we get lunch and it's all there. Not that those aren't useful and shouldn't be done, but more importantly is keeping these in people's minds. So half hour, even 15-minute within departmental meetings, putting a scenario together. How are we going to respond? Is there anything we need to do? And this allows you to give them those other ideas to help drive what could happen. Always try to use secondary resources. Often when we do these exercises, everybody's in a room, as opposed to saying, get rid of those who might be part of the event or make them part of the event. So secondary folks are there on their own, having to make the decisions without necessarily having their, the primary or their manager overseeing them. Make it real is really what I'm saying. Integration tests around business continuity, right? This is where we get the departments together, and now you simulate the conversation, not just around the table. Put them in different rooms, right? You've got to move up and you've got to send information. Use the phone, send the information, whatever it may be, and then you'll start seeing how those events will roll out. Will it be possible? I've even done one where we actually went to an alternate location. We started the tabletop and said, okay, building's unavailable. And we said, we've now got to move to the next location. And they were like, okay, well, we've moved. And we said, no, go. We're actually doing it. They had to get in their cars and drive across town to where they were going to go. Interesting thing about that was they realized, by doing that their plan for a 15-minute delay turned into an hour plus, just because of the situation. Either people couldn't find the room, it took them longer, whatever it may be. So doing some of those things in reality can be so helpful. Try to work with your partners if you can, especially critical partners. If you have somebody who's vital to your operations, or especially technology providers that might be providing things like if you're, an ADP customer or a Workday customer or a Microsoft Dynamics, whatever it may be. Microsoft a little bit harder, but try to get them involved to say, hey, can we, use you for an hour to talk about how you're going to do things? That would be great. Sometimes it's not possible, but it's always nice to ask. And then lastly, I've already talked about, secondary resources to review documentation, but also a good tabletop is not just a scenario based necessarily, but actual, just give a scenario and say, now we have to fully recover. Forget about the scenario itself. You might give it to them as part of that alternate site, but also what does a full recovery look like? You have to go through every single step, not just a piece to get through it in, a few hours, but really look at it end to end. This is especially important for IT when you say, give me every single step, right, that you need to do. It's amazing what you will find. Things like authentication, or there's certain aspects that nobody has talked about that need to be recovered first, right, that isn't necessarily been addressed. So all of those things, can you tell I'm really high on exercises and helping people prepare? That will also drive the different scenarios, but it'll also drive finding things that are not prepared. So communicating. Now we've talked about some of the different types of events that you need to look at. And by the way, you need to look at this from your individual location, right? So if we think about Arizona and in the Phoenix area where I live, we don't worry about tornadoes in this strict sense, or hurricanes necessarily, but we do worry about massive winter storms. We worry about microbursts, which are really mini tornadoes, if you will, because they can hit a single location. Or, we'll look at because our flight paths for our airport actually go directly over the city. It's not in the outskirts. It's in the middle of the metro area. We have to consider that. So we include those type of things, as well as things like hazardous spills that could occur because of where our freeways are built and where people are. So really consider those very specific things that could happen, not just what happened. Okay. Now, what you really want to start asking is using those type of events. And I'm going to go down to the fourth bullet here, but ask leadership and others, just those quick questions in these little mini sessions. What would happen if, right? And then use a recent event that maybe has not occurred to your organization, but has occurred somewhere else that's relevant, right? What if we had a criminal activity? What if this flooded because of a pipe or a water tower? What happens if, right? Getting people to start thinking through those. That's really helpful for executive leadership to make sure that they're seeing, hey, from a business continuity perspective, we're addressing these issues because this similar organization had one, or somebody in our area has gone through this, or somebody of our same size and skill set, or they've experienced this. Using that, that's especially helpful for cyber, right? If you can use something, and I liken the whole idea of if something happens to a member of your family, even extended family, it becomes real very quickly, right? If nobody in your family has ever had any kind of X illness, right, then it happens to someone else. As soon as a family member has cancer, as soon as family member has had some type of massive trauma or issue, that becomes very personal, and we get involved, right? So that should help if you can have that relationship with other organizations that are friendly to you, that are in your same vertical or are of the same size, culture, etc., so that you can share information. Report on the actions that have been used even in small situations. This really helps you demonstrate preparedness so that it isn't just always something that goes and is kind of insurance and a cost, right? We've actually leveraged something during a situation. And then, as I said, really as we start getting to people, start asking, what if this many people, or what if this person couldn't do their work? What if this department was completely unavailable for whatever reason, right? How does that work? That will help drive some of these other actions. Now, as we're talking here, you're going to have to use, well, this is why it could happen. So a lot of this is sometimes education, which is why those small exercises in terms of different types of scenarios is so helpful versus just doing the same ones over and over and over. So as you kind of heard me already say, kind of this continuity minute or this continuity short, send something out to folks. Here's a different scenario for you to consider, right? Every month, right? Make sure that teams are getting their ownership. So it's like, what are you going to do? Not what is the BC team going to do, right? Communicate, risks and what is done to limit and mitigate those risks, but also make sure people understand the risks. We've talked about the identifying things that have benefited. Participate in team meetings. Just go out so you can share that continuity minute, right? And frequent updates and changes. And one of the things I like to include here is include family and personal preparedness. Because of the work from home situation, having people think about how they're going to be prepared at home, how their family's going to be prepared. Because as I said, as soon as a family member or a significant other is impacted, your ability for them to work, if it's part of the crisis, goes down dramatically. The risk of them being unavailable is huge. So helping them be prepared just helps your organization out because people will be a little bit more available. Make sure that you're integrating all of your plans with information security, just because of the criticality, the likelihood, and impact that cyber type of events have on information. Your workarounds need to very much integrate with in the information security protections and ITDR in case you're making assumptions because of these events that I need to do XYZ, or I'm assuming that excuse me, I'm making assumptions that these certain technologies will be available, maybe cloud solutions, email, SharePoint, Google, whatever it may be. Make sure that that's legitimate and don't just make those assumptions. So this is kind of a reminder. Now that you've looked at all of that, this is where you come back to your documentation around actual events or things that could happen, right? Write the documentation not based on testing, but based on what a real event would be. Too often we look at the documentation and it's all based on the tests. But hey, this flood here, these people are out here, this technology is down for a week here, whatever it may be, and write your plans, actions, in that type of situation. Make sure you include all the necessary information, especially the workarounds. And if there's a need to prepare for that with certain spreadsheets or documents that need to have a template already built, make sure that's done. Or if you're planning on having reports that would be generated, those have to be done ahead of time and stored somewhere else. You can't look at it and say, okay, now I need IT to run that report if the system's down. Make sure you include the third-party dependencies. And as you're thinking about those different types of events, could your third party be impacted? And ask them if they're doing this as well. And then make sure you're integrating your communication. And this is where you have to sometimes think about internal departments, how they communicate, or especially external. What do they use to communicate? If you're assuming you're going to send an email and they don't necessarily, that's not your normal method of communication, or you're going to use a phone call and they're not phone based, or whatever it may be, understanding how they're expecting so that they understand if you're having an issue or they're having an issue, this is what's going to happen. Don't just say, well, we always have email, we always have phones. That's true. But is there a potential issue where the call won't come through, or there's certain blocking in place? This is especially important for email. If somebody says, yeah, if we're having a problem with email, we're going to be sending through this new domain, or we're going to be using personal addresses, your email filter may be blocking all of that, and now you're not getting this critical communication. So just having those conversations is really, really key, and understanding that, including those workarounds in your documentation and the communication. Make sure that what you do is actionable, and at the beginning of the document, keep things kind of very checklist, bulleted based, still detailed, but limit narrative, right? If what you're reading is a policy statement, that should either go to the back of your document or in a separate document itself. So think about it from a reference perspective. What do I need to know the minute an event happens? Not what's all the reason for and the purpose, and we will do. If a lot of things say we will do XYZ and it's in a paragraph, that's a training document. That's an information document, maybe for auditors or things. What you really want to make sure is if people need to reference their document, they can look right up front. What do I need to know so that I can act and I can respond? So last things to think about before I jump into questions is plan for what could occur, not just what has occurred. Don't look back in the future, but also don't look back into the past, look out into the future. Make sure it's specific to locations, your culture, your people, your products and services, vendors, how all of those are tied together, what could happen, right? And an example of that is, I know an organization that, they've got very good hurricane plans. They know how to secure things that are stored outside or move things as best as they can. But as they looked at their preparations, they realized they didn't have enough space for everything. So they had so much outside that they weren't prepared for it. They could secure it, but then they realized there was an additional risk of that could get damaged, or there could be rust, or something would happen. So they started having to address that. So they had to start changing their security or their tie down processes for things that were outside. Functional recovery should be the priority over generating a lot of documents, right? So what I mean by that is when we talk about a recovery plan or continuity plan or disaster recovery plan, it includes both the preparations, the capabilities, and the documentation. Documentation is not a plan. Documentation is the information that supports your plan, right? And so if your actual recovery plans, your actions, your workarounds, your preparations are not sufficient, having it documented doesn't make you more prepared. I've had organizations that call us in and say, we need a business continuity plan. We need a disaster recovery plan. But the reality is they have no capability. So all we're basically saying is, well, when it happens, you're going to identify a new location to work at. You're going to identify and purchase equipment. It's like, but that doesn't make them more functional. It just says, we've documented what we can't do. So don't replace documentation for functional capability. As I've said here again and again and again, exercises are the best training opportunity. Just sitting down and talking to people, while helpful and is not a bad thing, if people aren't practicing, then they're probably not prepared, because we all know we don't remember the things we don't do on a regular basis. And so especially around continuity, resiliency, those type of things, it's viewed as, this is my one-time thing. I've got to go through my policies. I've got to go through my DR. Have to do once a year, sign it off, done, never thought about it again. You want this to be part of the culture, and you want people to be thinking about, oh, this could happen, and now let me update my planning, my actions, and even my documentation. Okay. The next thing is, don't try to get everything in place around these. If you can just do something, 20% is better than zero. And if it's going to take you 3 years to get to 100%, I'd rather have you spend 3 months and get to 20% than wait for 3 years to be at 100%. At least you have some preparations in place. That's better than nothing. And then focus on outcome, target, ability to recover. As I said, that goes back to functional recovery. Don't worry about tasks, right? That's a real good thing to communicate up, to say, we are more prepared because we've done these exercises. People know what to do, right? If all you focus on is we've done 100 BIAs and we've developed 13 business continuity plans, but we've never exercised any of them, and all we ever do is review them on an annual basis, you're doing a lot of work, but it's not necessarily functionally capable. Not saying it isn't, it might be, but until you're demonstrating the capability, and it's more than just a quick, tabletop, it's demonstrated capability either technically or executing. One of my last tabletops, we actually pulled the people out, not pulled them out, we actually pulled out their documentation and said, okay, I need you to do this manually, and here's the information. And so they were filling it out. It's like, okay, what's next? Oh, I give it to her. Okay, what do you do? Oh, I take it, and I've got to call, vendor. Okay, pretend like you're calling the vendor for that, and they did it, or whatever. So, that was, and they were actually very happy that we did that, because they found a few things that didn't quite work. So, really focus on the capabilities. Don't just focus on a lot of tasks that are out there. All right. Well, again, thank you for your time. You have my email, you have my phone number. Please feel free to reach out at any time with any questions. I'm happy to answer those. That's just something that we do, not something that we charge for or we try to sell anything. If you just have a quick clarification, please reach out. More than happy to have a short conversation with you on that, around anything, around whether it's disaster recovery, where it's business continuity, resiliency kind of topics that will help you become more prepared and ability to support your organization. So with that, if there's nothing else, we will bid you a good afternoon and a wonderful week.